Chapter 13, Part 2, which will begin on the top of page 176. Because Soroya and I had never had an engagement period, much of what I learned about the Tahiris I learned after I married into their family. For example, I learned that once a month, the general suffered from blinding migraines that lasted almost a week. When the headache struck, the general went to his room, undressed, turned off the light, locked the door, and didn't come out until the pain subsided. No one was allowed to go in. No one was allowed to knock. Eventually he would emerge, dressed in his gray suit once more, smelling of sleep and bedsheets, his eyes puffy and bloodshot. I learned from Soroya that he and Khanum Tahiri had slept in separate rooms for as long as she could remember. I learned that he could be petty, such as when he'd take a bite out of the korma his wife placed before him, sigh, and push it away. "I'll make you something else," Khanum Tahiri would say, but he'd ignore her, sulk, and eat bread and onion. This made Soroya angry and her mother cry. Soroya told me he took antidepressants. I learned that he had kept his family on welfare and had never held a job in the U.S., preferring to cash government-issued checks than degrading himself with work unsuitable for a man of his stature. He saw the flea market only as a hobby, a way to socialize with his fellow Afghans. The general believed that sooner or later Afghanistan would be freed, the monarchy restored, and his services would once again be called upon. So every day he donned his gray suit, wound his pocket watch, and waited. I think it's interesting that this author is writing a contrast between General Tahiri, who's very prideful and believes in the Afghani customs, but who's willing to take government assistance, and juxtapose that with Baba, who is also prideful, very honorable, but never would take the government assistance. I wonder what you guys think about that. What are your thoughts on that contrast between those two men? And not just the contrast, but why do you think the author would write that contrast in? What's he trying to say? Just think about that. I learned that Khanum Tahiri, whom I called Khala Jamila now, had once been famous in Kabul for her enchanting singing voice. Though she had never sung professionally, she had had the talent to. I learned she could sing folk songs, ghazals, even raga, which was usually a man's domain. But as much as the general appreciated listening to music, he owned, in fact, a considerable collection of classical ghazal tapes by Afghan and Hindi singers. He believed the performing of it best left to those with lesser reputations. That she never sing in public had been one of the general's conditions when they had married. Soroya told me that her mother had wanted to sing at our wedding only one song, but the general gave her one of his looks, and the matter was buried. Khala Jamila played the lotto once a week and watched Johnny Carson every night. She spent her days in the garden, tending to her roses, geraniums, potato vines, and orchids. When I married Soroya, the flowers and Johnny Carson took a back seat. I was the new delight in Khala Jamila's life. Unlike the general's guarded and diplomatic manners, he didn't correct me when I continued to call him General Sahib. Khala Jamila made no secret of how much she adored me. For one thing, I listened to her impressive list of maladies, something the general had long turned a deaf ear to. Soroya told me that ever since her mother's stroke, every flutter in her chest was a heart attack, every aching joint the onset of rheumatoid arthritis, and every twitch of the eye another stroke. I remember the first time Khala Jamila mentioned a lump in her neck to me. "I'll skip school tomorrow and take you to the doctor," I said. To which the general smiled and said, "Then you might as well turn in your books for good, Bachem. Your Khala's medical charts are like the works of Rumi. They come in volumes." But it wasn't just that she'd found an audience for her monologues of illness. I firmly believed that if I had picked up a rifle and gone on a murdering rampage, I would still have had the benefit of her unblinking love. Because I had rid her heart of its gravest malady. I had relieved her of the greatest fear of every Afghan mother, that no honorable Kastagar would ask for her daughter's hand, that her daughter would age alone, husbandless, childless. Every woman needed a husband, even if he did silence the song in her. I think that that's metaphorical, silence the song. It's literal for the mom, but also metaphorical. So think about the ways in which he silences her song. All right, moving on. And from Soroya, I learned the details of what had happened in Virginia. We were at a wedding. Soroya's uncle, Sharif, the one who worked for the INS, was marrying his son to an Afghan girl from Newark. The wedding was at the same hall where, 6 months prior, Soroya and I had had our arsuri. We were standing in a crowd of guests, watching the bride accept rings from the groom's family, when we overheard 2 middle-aged women talking, their backs to us. "What a lovely bride," one of them said. "Just look at her. So maghboul, like the moon." "Yes," the other said, "and pure, too. Virtuous. No boyfriends." "I know. I tell you, that boy did well not to marry his cousin." Soroya broke down on the way home. I pulled the Ford off the curb, parked under a streetlight on Fremont Boulevard. "It's all right," I said, pushing back her hair. "Who cares?" "It's so fucking unfair," she barked. "Just forget it. Their sons go out to nightclubs looking for meat and get their girlfriends pregnant. They have kids out of wedlock and no one says a goddamn thing. Oh, they're just men having fun. I make one mistake and suddenly everyone is talking Nang and Namus, and I have to have my face rubbed in it for the rest of my life." I wiped a tear from her jawline, just above her birthmark, with the pad of my thumb. I just want to stop there for a second and talk to you guys about what we talked about in class, about the idea of women degrading other women, and the fact that we have to build one another up and hold each other high because society will pull us down. And I think this is an example of that society has a very double standard for what men are allowed to do and what women are allowed to do in this culture. All right, going back. "I didn't tell you," Soroya said, dabbing at her eyes, "but my father showed up with a gun that night. He told him that he had 2 bullets in the chamber, one for him and one for himself if I didn't come home. I was screaming, calling my father all kinds of names, saying he couldn't keep me locked up forever, that I wished he were dead." Fresh tears squeezed out between her lids. "I actually said that to him, that I wished he were dead. When he brought me home, my mother threw her arms around me and she was crying too. She was saying things, but I couldn't understand any of it because she was slurring her words so badly. So my father took me up to my bedroom and sat me in front of the dresser mirror. He handed me a pair of scissors and calmly told me to cut off all my hair. He watched while I did it. I didn't step out of the house for weeks, and when I did, I heard whispers or imagined them everywhere I went. That was 4 years ago and 3,000 miles away, and I'm still hearing them." "Fuck 'em," I said. She made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "When I told you about this on the phone the night of Kastagari, I was sure you'd change your mind." "No chance of that, Soroya." She smiled and took my hand. "I am so lucky to have found you. You're so different from every Afghan guy I've met. Let's never talk about this again, okay?" "Okay." I kissed her cheek and pulled away from the curb. As I drove, I wondered why I was different. Maybe it was because I had been raised by men. I hadn't grown up around women and had never been exposed firsthand to the double standard with which Afghan society sometimes treated them. Maybe it was because Baba had been such an unusual Afghan father, a liberal who had lived by his own rules, a maverick who had discarded or embraced societal customs as he had seen fit. But I think a big part of the reason I didn't care about Soroya's past was that I had one of my own. I knew all about regret. And I would underline that section. I had a past of my own. I knew all about regret. Because again, it shows that Amir is just still living with the horror of what he has done. Shortly after Baba's death, Soroya and I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Fremont, just a few blocks away from the General and Khala Jamila's house. Soroya's parents bought us a brown leather couch and a set of mikasa dishes as housewarming presents. The general gave me an additional present, a brand new IBM typewriter. In the box he had slipped a note written in Farsi. Amirjan, I hope you discover many tales on these keys. General Tahiri. I sold Baba's VW bus, and to this day I have not gone back to the flea market. I would drive to his gravesite every Friday, and sometimes I'd find a fresh bouquet of freesias by the headstone and know Soroya had been there too. Soroya and I settled into the routines and minor wonders of married life. We shared toothbrushes and socks, passed each other the morning paper. She slept on the right side of the bed. I preferred the left. She liked fluffy pillows. I liked the hard ones. She ate her cereal dry like a snack and chased it with milk. I got my acceptance at San Jose State that summer and declared an English major. I took on a security job, swing shift, at a furniture warehouse in Sunnyvale. The job was dreadfully boring, but its saving grace was a considerable one. When everyone left at 6 p.m. and shadows began to crawl between aisles of plastic-covered sofas piled to the ceiling, I took out my books and studied. It was in the pine-sol-scented office of that furniture warehouse that I began my first novel. Soroya joined me at San Jose State the following year and enrolled, to her father's chagrin, in the teaching track. I don't know why you're wasting your talents like this, the general said one night over dinner. Did you know, Amirjan, that she earned nothing but A's in high school? He turned to her. An intelligent girl like you should become a lawyer, a political scientist, and, inshallah, when Afghanistan is free, you could help write the new constitution. There would be a need for young, talented Afghans like you. They might even offer you a ministry position, given your family name. I could see Soroya holding back, her face tightening. I'm not a girl, Padar. I'm a married woman. Besides, they'd need teachers, too. Anyone can teach. Is there any more rice, Madar? Soroya said. After the general excused himself to meet some friends in Hayward, Khala Jamila tried to console Soroya. He means well, she said. He just wants you to be successful. So he can boast about his attorney daughter to his friends. Another medal for the general, Soroya said. Such nonsense you speak. Successful, Soroya hissed. At least I'm not like him, sitting around while other people fight the Shirawi, waiting for when the dust settles, so he can move in and reclaim his posh little government position. Teaching may not pay much, but it's what I want to do. It's what I love, and it's a whole lot better than collecting welfare, by the way. Khala Jamila bit her tongue. If he ever hears you saying that, he will never speak to you again. Don't worry, Soroya snapped, tossing her napkin on the plate. I won't bruise his precious ego. In the summer of 1988, about 6 months before the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, I finished my first novel, a father-son story set in Kabul, written mostly with the typewriter the general had given me. I sent query letters to a dozen agencies and was stunned one August day when I opened our mailbox and found a request from a New York agency for the completed manuscript. I mailed it the next day. Soroya kissed the carefully wrapped manuscript, and Khala Jamila insisted we pass it under the Quran. She told me that she was going to do nazar for me, a vow to have a sheep slaughtered and the meat given to the poor if my book was accepted. Please, no nazar, Khala-Jan, I said, kissing her face. Just do zakat. Give the money to someone in need, okay? No sheep killing. And there's that metaphor of the sheep again coming back up. 6 weeks later, a man named Martin Greenwald called from New York and offered to represent me. I only told Soroya about it. But just because I have an agent doesn't mean I'll get published. If Martin sells the novel, then we'll celebrate. A month later, Martin called and informed me I was going to be a published novelist. When I told Soroya, she screamed. We had a celebration dinner with Soroya's parents that night. Khala Jamila made kofta, meatballs and white rice, and white fernie. The general, a sheen of moisture in his eyes, said that he was proud of me. After General Tahiri and his wife left, Soroya and I celebrated with an expensive bottle of Merlot I had bought on the way home. The general did not approve of women drinking alcohol, and Soroya didn't drink in his presence. "I am so proud of you," she said, raising her glass to mine. "Kaka would have been proud, too." "I know," I said, thinking of Baba, wishing he could have seen me. Later that night, after Soroya fell asleep, wine always made her sleepy, I stood on the balcony and breathed in the cool summer air. I thought of Rahim Khan and the little note of support he had written me after he'd read my first story. And I thought of Hassan. "Someday, inshallah, you will be a great writer," he had said once, "and people all over the world will read your stories." There was so much goodness in my life, so much happiness. I wondered whether I deserved any of it. The novel was released in the summer of that following year, 1989, and the publisher sent me on a 5-city book tour. I became a minor celebrity in the Afghan community. That was the year that the Shirawi completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan. It should have been a time of glory for Afghans. Instead, the war raged on, this time between Afghans, the Mujahideen, against the Soviet puppet government of Najibullah, and Afghan refugees kept flocking to Pakistan. That was the year that the Cold War ended, the year the Berlin Wall came down. It was the year of Tiananmen Square. In the midst of it all, Afghanistan was forgotten, and General Tahiri, whose hopes had stirred awake after the Soviets pulled out, went back to winding his pocket watch. That was also the year that Soroya and I began trying to have a child. The idea of fatherhood unleashed a swirl of emotions in me. I found it frightening, invigorating, daunting, and exhilarating all at the same time. What sort of father would I make, I wondered. I wanted to be just like Baba, and I wanted to be nothing like him. But a year passed, and nothing happened. With each cycle of blood, Soroya grew more frustrated, more impatient, more irritable. By then, Khala Jamila's initially subtle hints had become overt, as in, "Kodega, so, when am I going to sing Allahu for my little Nawasa?" The general, ever the Pashtun, never made any queries. Doing so meant alluding to a sexual act between his daughter and a man, even if the man in question had been married to her for over 4 years. But his eyes perked up when Khala Jamila teased us about a baby. "Sometimes it takes a while," I told Soroya one night. "A year isn't a while, Amir," she said, in a terse voice so unlike her. "Something's wrong, I know it." "Then let's see a doctor." Dr. Rosen, a round-bellied man with a plump face and small, even teeth, spoke with a faint Eastern European accent, something remotely Slavic. He had a passion for trains. His office was littered with books about the history of the railroads, model locomotives, paintings of trains trundling on tracks through green hills and over bridges. A sign above his desk read, "Life is a train. Get on board." He laid out the plan for us. I'd get checked first. "Men are easy," he said, fingers tapping on his mahogany desk. "A man's plumbing is like his mind. Simple. Very few surprises. You ladies, on the other hand, well, God put a lot of thought into making you." I wondered if he fed that bit about the plumbing to all of his couples. "Lucky us," Soroya said. Dr. Rosen laughed. It fell a few notches short of genuine. He gave me a lab slip in a plastic jar, handed Soroya a request for some routine blood tests. We shook hands. "Welcome aboard," he said, as he showed us out. I passed with flying colors. The next few months were a blur of tests on Soroya. Basal body temperatures, blood tests for every conceivable hormone, urine tests, something called a cervical mucus test, ultrasounds, more blood tests, and more urine tests. Soroya underwent a procedure called a hysteroscopy. Dr. Rosen inserted a telescope into Soroya's uterus and took a look around. He found nothing. "The plumbing's clear," he announced, snapping off his latex gloves. I wished he'd stop calling it that. We weren't bathrooms. When the tests were over, he explained that he couldn't explain why we couldn't have kids, and apparently that wasn't so unusual. It was called unexplained infertility. Then came the treatment phase. We tried a drug called clomiphene and HMG, a series of shots which Soroya gave to herself. When these failed, Dr. Rosen advised in vitro fertilization. We received a polite letter from our HMO wishing us the best of luck, regretting they couldn't cover the cost. HMO is just the insurance. We used the advance I had received for my novel to pay for it. IVF proved lengthy, meticulous, frustrating, and ultimately unsuccessful. After months of sitting in waiting rooms, reading magazines like Good Housekeeping and Reader's Digest, after endless paper gowns and cold, sterile exam rooms lit by fluorescent lights, the repeated humiliation of discussing every detail of our sex life with a total stranger, the injections and probes and specimen collections, we went back to Dr. Rosen and his trains. He sat across from us, tapped his desk with his fingers, and used the word adoption for the first time. Soroya cried all the way home. Soroya broke the news to her parents the weekend after our last visit with Dr. Rosen. We were sitting on picnic chairs in the Tahiri's backyard, grilling trout and sipping yogurt dough. It was an early evening in March 1991. Khala Jamila had watered the roses and her new honeysuckles, and their fragrance mixed with the smell of cooking fish. Twice already she had reached across her chair to caress Soroya's hair and say, "God knows best, Bahem. Maybe it wasn't meant to be." Soroya kept looking down at her hands. She was tired, I knew, tired of all of it. "The doctor said we could adopt," she murmured. General Tahiri's head snapped up at this. He closed the barbecue lid. "He did?" "He said it was an option," Soroya said. We'd talked at home about adoption. Soroya was ambivalent at best. "I know it's silly and maybe vain," she said to me on the way to her parents' house, "but I can't help it. I've always dreamed that I'd hold it in my arms and know my blood had fed it for 9 months. That I'd look in its eyes one day and be startled to see you or me. That the baby would grow up and have your smile or mine. Without that... Is that wrong?" "No," I had said. "Am I being selfish?" "No, Soroya. Because if you really want to do it..." "No," I said. "If we're going to do it, we shouldn't have any doubts at all about it. And we should both be in agreement. It wouldn't be fair to the baby otherwise." She rested her head on the window and said nothing else the rest of the way. Now the general sat beside her. "Bahem, this adoption thing, I'm not so sure it's for us Afghans." Soroya looked at me tiredly and sighed. "For one thing, they grow up and want to know who their natural parents are, nor can you blame them. Sometimes they leave the home in which you labored for years to provide for them, so they can find the people who gave them life. Blood is a powerful thing, Bahem. Never forget that." "I don't want to talk about this anymore," Soroya said. "I'll say one more thing," he said. I could tell he was getting revved up. We were about to get one of the general's little speeches. "Take Amirjan here. We all knew his father. I know who his grandfather was in Kabul and his great-grandfather before him. I could sit here and trace generations of his ancestors for you if you asked. That's why, when his father, God give him peace, came Kastagari, I didn't hesitate. And believe me, his father wouldn't have agreed to ask for your hand if he didn't know whose descendant you were. Blood is a powerful thing, Bahem. And when you adopt, you don't know whose blood you're bringing into your house. Now, if you were American, it wouldn't matter. People here marry for love. Family name and ancestry never even come into the equation. They adopt that way, too. As long as the baby is healthy, everyone is happy. But we are Afghans, Bahem." "Is the fish almost ready?" Soroya said. General Tahiri's eyes lingered on her. He patted her knee. "Just be happy you have your health and a good husband." "What do you think, Amirjan?" Khala Jamila said. I put my glass on the ledge where a row of her potted geraniums were dripping water. "I think I agree with General Sahib." Reassured, the general nodded and went back to the grill. We all had our reasons for not adopting. Soroya had hers, the general his, and I had this. That perhaps something, someone, somewhere, had decided to deny me fatherhood for the things I had done. Maybe this was my punishment, and perhaps justly so. It wasn't meant to be. Kala Jamila had said. Or maybe it was meant not to be. And I marked that section, starting with "we all had our reasons," because again, it shows that lingering guilt. It shows that he feels he needs to be punished. A few months later, we used the advance for my second novel and placed a down payment on a pretty 2-bedroom Victorian house in San Francisco's Bernal Heights. It had a peaked roof, hardwood floors, and a tiny backyard which ended in a sun deck and a fire pit. The general helped me refinish the deck and paint the walls. Kala Jamila bemoaned us moving almost an hour away, especially since she thought Soroya needed all the love and support she could get, oblivious to the fact that her well-intended but overbearing sympathy was precisely what was driving Soroya to move. Sometimes, Soroya sleeping next to me, I lay in bed and listened to the screen door swinging open and shut with the breeze, to the crickets chirping in the yard. And I could almost feel the emptiness in Soroya's womb, like it was a living, breathing thing. It had seeped into our marriage, that emptiness, into our laughs and our lovemaking. And late at night, in the darkness of our room, I'd feel it rising from Soroya and settling between us, sleeping between us, like a newborn child.